All right, we are continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew here on the Listener's Commentary. And in this recording, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 21, verses 23 through 46. And Jesus has just recently ridden into Jerusalem as king, being hailed as the Messiah by the crowds, probably the crowds of Galilean pilgrims who came with him up to the feast. Then he entered into the temple, like the heart and soul of Judaism itself, called out the leaders, overturned the tables of the money changers, associated texts with that action from the Old Testament prophets about judgment upon Jerusalem because of their faithlessness. And in doing all of that, he is really assuming his authority as Messiah. Well, these actions provoke the temple leadership to challenge Jesus' authority. That's what's going to be happening in this section that we're going to look at in this recording. They come and they challenge Jesus' authority. Jesus responds with a question, and then out of that question, he responds with 3 parables. And those parables extend all the way into chapter 22. So here we will look at what's included in chapter 21. Then we'll look at the third parable at the first part of chapter 22. So here's the way this section opens. When he entered the temple area, so recall the last session where Jesus was coming into Jerusalem, curses a fig tree. And now he finishes that trip into Jerusalem, enters into the temple area itself. And so when he came into the temple area, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him while he was teaching. So he's in the temple, he's teaching in the temple. And so they come to him and they said, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" What they're asking is, who gave you the right to teach and who gave you the right to do these sorts of prophetic acts you've done? These people controlled the temple. They controlled who could be in the temple, who could teach in the temple, and who not. So what they're really asking Jesus is for his credentials. Who gave you credentials? Which rabbi authorized you to teach? That's really what they're getting at. Who gave you this authority? Can you show us your credentials? Break out your degree. Show us your card. Which rabbi authorized you to teach in the temple? But, verse 24, Jesus responded and said to them, "I will ask you one question, which, if you tell me the answer to my question, if you tell me, I will tell you also by what authority I do these things." And so he responds to their question with a question of his own, which was a very common form of dialogue and discussion and debate among the rabbis of Jesus' day. It was a well-established method of thinking things through. So this wouldn't have been out of the blue. All right, when Jesus responds to their question with a question, normal. And so here's this question. The baptism of John, was that from heaven or from men? Jesus' question is dealing with the same issue, and that issue is the source and authority of John's baptism. Where did it come from? Was it from heaven? Did heaven authorize it? Did heaven commission John? Or was it from people, mankind? And so it's really dealing with the exact same issue that they're asking Jesus, and it's about where did John come from? Where did he get his authority? And it puts the leaders on the spot. Look how they wrestle with the question. And they began considering the implications among themselves before they answer, right? This technique is to get people to think it through. So they discuss it among themselves before they give Jesus an answer. And they began considering the implications among themselves, saying, if we say, from heaven, he will say to us, then why didn't you believe him? Right? They had sent some of their own. If you go back to the beginning of Matthew's gospel, they had sent some of their own to go check out John's ministry, investigate it, and report back. And their conclusion was they rejected its legitimacy. John was illegitimate. No need to go there. So that they have already done that, but they were like, why didn't you believe him? But, verse 26, if we say from men, well, we fear the people, for they all regard John as a prophet. So if we answer from men, we got a problem because the people believe that John was a prophet, and then all these people will revolt against us and reject us and cause problems for us. So what do they decide to do? Well, look at verse 27. And answering Jesus, they said, we don't know. They plead the fifth. They say, we don't know. We're not going to say from heaven. We're not going to say from men, because either answer causes too many problems for us. So we're just going to say, we don't know. And by doing that, in that response to Jesus, Jesus' question has cleverly unmasked their duplicity. They don't care about truth. They don't care if someone really is from God or not. They're more interested in protecting their positions of wealth and power. They're more interested in keeping up appearances with the people. So truth, who really cares? We don't know. And Jesus, by his question, has unmasked all of that. And so Jesus said to them, well, neither am I telling you by what authority I do these things. Since they're not really interested in looking for the truth and figuring out the truth, guess what? Jesus isn't going to play their game. He's not going to engage in their little game. And so, no, I'm not going to tell you by what authority I do these things. Nevertheless, he's not done talking. He will tell them a parable, actually several that go all the way into chapter 22, and it's a series of parables that challenges them and their self-righteousness. So here's the first parable, verse 28. Now, what do you think? A man had 2 sons. He came to the first and said, "Son, go work today in the vineyard." But he replied, "I don't want to." Yet afterward he regretted it and went. And so even though he didn't want to, he initially rejected his father's instructions, he repented and went into the vineyard and worked. The man came to his second son and said the same thing, "Go work in the vineyard." And he replied, "Yes, sir, I will." And yet he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father? And they answered, that is, the Jewish leaders that Jesus is talking to, they answered and said, the first. In other words, even though that first son said he wasn't going to, he regretted it, repented, and went and did the work. The second was all, excited. "Oh, sure, I will do that. Got you. I will go do that." And yet he didn't go. Clearly, the first did the will of the Father. And then Jesus makes the point. Pay attention to the word believe in what Jesus says. Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you that the tax collectors and the prostitutes will get into the kingdom of God before you." Think of the shock of what Jesus said. He's in the temple. He's talking to the temple leadership. He's talking to those who run the temple. They're supposed to be the most religious people of the day. And Jesus is comparing the tax collectors and the prostitutes to the first son in the parable. They maybe initially rejected doing the Father's will, but they're repenting and regretting it, and they're coming around, and they're rallying around Jesus, and thus, Jesus says, they're going to get into God's kingdom before you. This is a massive insult to these people as well as a shock. The tax collectors and prostitutes before the Jewish leaders. And then Jesus goes on and continues to explain in verse 32. He says, "For John," whom Jesus asked them about just a second ago, "for John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you didn't believe him. But the tax collectors and prostitutes, they did believe him. And you, seeing this, didn't even have second thoughts." Like, you rejected it, didn't have second thoughts, like the first son in the parable. And so you didn't even believe him. You didn't have second thoughts and afterwards believed John. Jesus had just asked them about John. They refused to answer. So Jesus here attaches believing and listening to John, and thus by extension also to Jesus, with doing God's will. And what Jesus is saying is, in rejecting John and all that John taught, including pointing towards Jesus as the Messiah, in rejecting all of that, you're failing to do God's will. And so you're really actually in a worse position than the tax collectors and the prostitutes. Jesus goes on then to tell another parable, verse 33. Listen to another parable. And this next parable is about a landowner and a vineyard. Now, recall, as we noted in an earlier recording, that vineyards were well established as a symbol for Israel, and especially for the temple and for the temple leadership. The key passage, or at least one key passage on that out of the Old Testament, is Isaiah chapter 5, 1 through 7, where Isaiah tells a little story about God planting a vineyard, and the vineyard represents his people, and the vineyard produced no fruit. the temple, as I noted in that previous recording, had this golden grapevine woven around the pillars at its entrance. So here, Jesus is in the temple, and he's going to tell a parable using the imagery of vines and a vineyard about their failed leadership, their failed spiritual leadership. Listen to the story and pay attention to the word fruit in this story. There was a landowner. So this man is wealthy and he's got lots of land. So there was a landowner who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it. All of this is standard fare, very familiar, and dug a wine press in it. You're going to grow grapes, and then you're going to gather the grapes, and you're going to press the juice out of the grapes. So you got to have a wine press in your vineyard. All this is familiar. So he plants a vineyard, put a fence around it, put a wine press in it, and built a tower. The tower in a vineyard was for a watchtower to make sure there were no invaders, make sure there was no animals getting into the vineyard and destroying it. It was a way you could just kind of keep an eye on your on your vineyard. So he built a tower, and then he leased it to some vine growers, went on a journey. So he gets his land all ready to produce crops. He goes away, and he leased it out to some tenant farmers. Again, standard fare. This was common practice in Jesus' world. And when the harvest time approached, he sent his slaves, his servants, to the vine growers to receive his fruit. It's harvest time. He's ready to reap the rewards of his vineyard and make some money off of his vineyard. And so he sends his servants to the vine growers who are renting the field and working it on his behalf. And the vine growers took his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. So this wealthy landowner who's employed these people and given them this land to work so that they have jobs to do, and they're going to get they're actually going to benefit from it as well. When the servants from the landowner comes, they beat him, kill him, and stoned another one to death. So again, this landowner, because he's merciful, didn't immediately come and take out the tenant farmers. He sent other servants, this time a larger group than the first. And guess what? The tenant farmers did the same thing to them, beat them, killed them, and all of that. So the landowner, again, because he's patient and merciful, this time he sent his son, saying, "They will respect my son." Now, don't miss the connection with Jesus, the son of the landowner, the son of God, who is the landowner of Israel. Don't miss that connection in Jesus' mind. And they will respect my son. But when the vine growers saw the son, not the servant, the son, they said among themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take possession of his inheritance." So their reaction is, if we get rid of the heir, then when the landowner dies, guess what? There's no one to claim this land. We can seize it for ourselves. It'll be ours. And so they took the son, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine growers? Now, you have to have all the associations that Jesus probably has in his mind to feel the force a little bit of this, right? He's told this story. He uses everyday language. These people have killed the heir who's supposed to be the one that's going to run the vineyard. The tenant farmers are renting it on behalf. They don't actually own the land. They're doing it for the landowner. And all of that in Jesus' mind. And if these people didn't get so caught up in the story, in their mind, they would know that this has to do with Israel and God's son, who bare minimum is at least God's king, who's going to rule on his behalf. And in Jesus' mind, he knows these people want to claim their power and keep their power. They've already demonstrated they're more interested in that than the truth, right? And so when the owner of the vineyard comes, meaning when God returns to his people, what will he do to those vine growers? Well, they're caught up in the story, and so they respond in the context of the story. Here's what everyone would expect would happen to those tenant farmers in that kind of situation. Verse 41, they said to him, "He, the landowner, will bring those wretches to a wretched end, and he'll lease the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the fruit in the proper seasons." In other words, he's going to rent it out. He's going to get rid of these bad tenant farmers, and he'll lease it to others who are trustworthy and responsible and loyal and faithful. That's what would happen in real life. And they're so caught up in the story, they don't even seem to realize that they're actually condemning themselves. And so look how Jesus responds. Once they answer his question about what will happen when the landowner comes back, here's what Jesus says, verse 42. Jesus said to them, "Did you never read the scriptures?" I've always found those kind of phrases in Jesus' teaching very painfully ironic. Who's he speaking to? The people who know the scriptures better than anyone else. They're the religious leaders. Haven't you ever read the scriptures? And then he quotes from Psalm 118, a psalm that has been kind of at work in the whole first couple days of Jesus' final week here in Jerusalem. It was the Psalm 118 was what was quoted as he rode into Jerusalem, right? And so here we have Psalm 118 again. It says this, "A stone which the builders rejected, this has become the chief cornerstone. And this came about from the Lord, and it's marvelous in our eyes." And so, again, quoting Psalm 118, it's the passage used to hail Jesus Messiah when he rode into town. It's a strongly messianic text. And here Jesus says, haven't you paid attention to what it actually says? It says, the builders, that is, the leaders, will reject the cornerstone, the chief cornerstone, the Messiah. And yet God will use him to build his people. He will be the cornerstone of a new household, a new temple around him. And that Jesus implies, he's saying, that's what you're doing. So Jesus drives home the point in verse 43 saying, "Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to people producing its fruit." That's what this has all been about. That's what this whole parable has been about. When Jesus quotes from Psalm 118, what he's getting at is, you all are the builders who are doing the rejecting, and I am like the son in the parable who becomes the chief cornerstone around whom God is going to build his new household, his new people. That's what it's been all about. And notice what he says. He's going to give the kingdom to people who produce its fruit. Just like in the parable, the tenant farmers didn't give the owner his fruit that was due to him. Well, there's going to be people who do. They are faithful and they're loyal, and they will give God his fruit, and it's to them that he will give the kingdom of God. A fruitless religious establishment who is rejecting the Messiah is going to be rejected by God. And then Jesus continues taking language from, again, Isaiah and from this idea of the cornerstone, and says this in verse 44, "And the one who falls on this stone," the stone that the builders rejected, the stone that is going to be the chief cornerstone, the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and on whomever the stone itself falls, it will crush him. That this stone is going to have this effect of breaking people, maybe breaking them to the point where they actually cry out for help, or it's going to crush them, and judgment then will come from those who reject this stone. That is, the Messiah in Psalm 119 is God's chief cornerstone. You reject that stone, you will be crushed by it. Well, how do the chief priests and the Pharisees in the temple respond to this? Look at verse 45. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard these parables, they understood that he was speaking about them. They got the point. They recognized that they were the primary referent of him in these parables, that they were like the tenant farmers who were killing the prophets and killing God's servants sent to them over the centuries, just like the leaders of Israel had done in Isaiah's day and in Jeremiah's day. So too in Jesus' day, the leaders are still faithless and fruitless, and they understood the point. And although they sought to arrest him, they feared the crowds, since the crowds considered Jesus to be a prophet. So they weren't sure what to do. They wanted to get rid of him. They wanted to remove him. They were incensed. They couldn't believe he attacked them right there in the temple. They want to get rid of him, but there's just so many people in Jerusalem, and Jesus has been hailed as the Messiah as he's coming to town. He's carrying out ministry. People are gathering around him. He's healing them. It's like, man, if we do it here, we don't know what's going to happen. And so they hold off and they come up with another plan. Now, let me just offer, by way of wrap up, one little reflection on this, that this whole section, really even the last recording and this section, has been about fruitfulness, about faithfulness and fruitfulness. And when you put those two together in the context of Jesus' teaching here, you get an answer to this question. In Jesus' kingdom, what's the measure of success? In Jesus' kingdom, what's the measure of what's the target? What's success? What does the king expect from his people? And the answer to that question we learn here and in the previous recording. We learn that the answer to that question is he expects faithfulness and fruitfulness. In fact, faithfulness will lead to fruitfulness. And if there's no fruitfulness, then that calls into question your faithfulness. That was true for the chief priests and the Pharisees then, and it's still true now. Religiousness, religiosity, that does not replace fruitfulness according to the values and virtues and purposes of God. In fact, even zeal and excitement, like the crowds who rode in with Jesus and hailed him as the Messiah, even that kind of zeal and excitement and religious enthusiasm, well, that's not going to replace fruitfulness. The king, Jesus himself, King Jesus, he expects good fruit that comes from loyal trust. That's what he expects of his people. That's the target. That's the measure of success in King Jesus' kingdom. Good fruit, faithfulness that leads to fruitfulness. All right, thanks for tuning in to this session on the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generosity of all sorts of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support, and you can always join the team of supporters to help this ministry continue to expand and reach more people by going to listenerscommentary.com, clicking the Give button, and it'll redirect you to a page through World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit, where you can put in a dollar amount. You can click a little box if you want to make it monthly that says Make This Monthly, and you can give a one-time or a monthly donation right there. Thanks a ton for your support.